Penguin Random House Audio presents The Legends Club, Dean Smith, Mike Krzyzewski, Jim Valvano, and the story of an epic college basketball rivalry. This is the author, John Feinstein. This is for Ken Denlinger, who taught me about college hoops, journalism, and life. Introduction. In a very real sense, this book was born on February 28, 1976, Dean Smith's 45th birthday. It was on that afternoon that a very nervous reporter from Duke's student newspaper, The Chronicle, timidly introduced himself to the great man in a corner of the North Carolina locker room in Carmichael Auditorium. North Carolina had just finished beating Duke 91-71, dropping Duke's record to 13-13. The outcome wasn't a surprise. Carolina was ranked 4th in the country and had run away with the ACC regular season title, finishing 11-1. The Tar Heels were 24-2 overall and had 4 players on their roster who would be on the U.S. Olympic team coached by Dean Smith that summer: Mitch Kupchak, Walter Davis, Tommy Lagarde, and the great Phil Ford. Duke had Tate Armstrong, who was my excuse to talk to Dean Smith. Armstrong had been lighting up ACC gyms all winter, a one-man show on a struggling team. Duke coach Bill Foster was in his second season, trying to rebuild the fallen Duke program. Armstrong had just finished his freshman season when Foster arrived and was now a junior. Armstrong did have some help from a superb freshman named Jim Spanarkel, but the Blue Devils were overmatched in the ACC, as their 3-9 conference record proved. For the season, Armstrong was averaging 24.2 points per game, making an astounding 52% of his shots. That was with no three-point shot and no shot clock, and with other teams gearing their defenses to stop him. He was a slender 6'2", and spent as much time on the floor after being knocked down as he did in his shooting motion. He'd scored 29 points that day against Carolina. I was going to write a column making the case that if ever a player from a team that finished 7th in a 7-team conference deserved consideration for Player of the Year, it was Armstrong. I might have been just a tad biased. Smith was talking to another writer when I walked up. When he finished the conversation he'd been having, he looked at me as if to say, "And?" Finding my voice somewhere, I said, "Coach Smith, my name is John Feinstein, and I work for the Chronicle, the Duke student newspaper." I had my hand out as I spoke, and Smith shook it, stopping me before I could go further by saying, "I know who you are. I read the column you wrote last month, saying that Bill, Foster, should copy some of what we do here to rebuild over at Duke. I thought you were very fair to us, for someone from Duke." I had been more than fair. I had been gushy. But that wasn't the point. I was standing in front of Dean Smith, and he was telling me he had read something I had written. I was, to put it mildly, stunned. As I've written often in the past, it was later that I learned that the North Carolina basketball office subscribed to every newspaper in North Carolina, the major national papers, and all the student newspapers in the ACC. An assistant coach was assigned to comb through the papers and clip anything relevant to Carolina for Smith to read. He would put the clips in his briefcase and read them on airplanes. Still stunned, I somehow got my question out about Armstrong. I'm not sure he ever answered it. Instead, he talked about how proud he was of Ford and Davis, but especially John Kuester, for the defensive job they'd done all that day on Armstrong, even if he had scored almost half of Duke's points. Somewhere in the middle of the answer, he asked me where I'd grown up. I said New York. "City?" he asked. I nodded. "Well," he said, "I guess that explains why you understand basketball." Do you think he completely owned me at that moment? I asked one more question. Early in the game, when it was still close, a couple of calls had gone against Carolina. Some of the students had started a profane chant. It didn't last very long because Smith walked straight to the scorer's table, took the PA microphone, pointed in the direction of the students and said, "Stop, now. We don't do that here. We win with class at Carolina." They stopped instantly. When I asked about the incident, he smiled again. "I was disappointed that happened," he said. "It won't happen here again." Then he added, We're not Duke. And at that moment, Duke was miles and miles from being North Carolina. If the book was born on that day in 1976, it began to take form in March of 1980, when, in a 9-day period, Duke hired Mike Krzyzewski to replace Bill Foster as basketball coach, and North Carolina State hired Jim Valvano to replace Norman Sloan in the same capacity. Sloan and Foster had each had considerable success. Sloan had won a national championship in 1974, and Foster had taken Duke to the national title game in 1978. But the aura of Dean had driven both men away, Foster to South Carolina, Sloan to Florida. The two men who succeeded them were kids in the coaching profession, Valvano 34, Krzyzewski 33. They had coached against each other at Iona and Army, both New York area schools that were about 500 miles and worlds away from North Carolina's Research Triangle. Neither had any clue about what the ACC was like or how important Dean Smith was in their new home state. If Jimmy and I had landed in a spaceship from Mars instead of on airplanes from New York, we couldn't possibly have had less understanding of what an icon Dean was, Krzyzewski said years later. We both thought we did. We knew Carolina was very good every year, but we had no clue. He shook his head. I mean, no clue. They learned quickly, and in some ways painfully. Valvano tried to take Smith on with humor, and to some degree it worked. Winning a national championship in 1983 worked better. Krzyzewski confronted Smith head-on from the beginning, challenging him first by trying to make it clear to the world he wouldn't back down from him. As with Valvano, he learned that good players and good teams were far more effective. Valvano, as it turned out, was the hare, dashing ahead with remarkable speed when he first arrived at NC State, not only with the national championship, but with his completely unbridled personality. Krzyzewski, watching from 25 miles away, could only shake his head, watching the Valvano rocket ship take off. Being honest, I didn't like him at the time, he said. Or at the very least, I didn't want to be like him. He smiled. Of course, being completely honest, I couldn't have been like him if I'd wanted to be. There was no one else like him. Krzyzewski was the tortoise, at least compared to Valvano's speed-of-light personality, plodding along, working relentlessly, never losing sight of his goal, which was to build a long-term winner at Duke. Slowly but surely, he put together one of the great dynasties in college basketball history. He caught and passed Valvano. Amazingly, years later, he caught and passed Smith. And in 2015, he was still going, having become an icon much the same way Smith was an icon. The only real difference, I suppose, is that a college junior walking around the Duke locker room today isn't likely to encounter Krzyzewski standing off in a corner. But if he did, and if he happened to ask about Smith or Valvano, there would be a remarkable story to be told. Which is why I wanted to write this book. I wasn't born to write it, but I lived it. I was working for the Washington Post when Krzyzewski and Valvano first landed in North Carolina. By then, I knew all three men. I'd met Krzyzewski and Valvano at the exact same moment during my senior year in college, and after arriving at the Post, I had written about Smith every chance I got. In December of 1976, Duke was playing Connecticut, an insignificant game between two insignificant teams in those days, at Madison Square Garden. And as sports editor of the Chronicle, I had flown to New York with Bill Foster, Tate Armstrong, and Duke Sports Information Director Tom Mickle. Mickle was bringing Foster and Armstrong in a day early to do some media interviews, and I tagged along because it was an excuse to go home for a couple of days. We went straight from the airport to the weekly writer's lunch at Mama Leone's, a famous Italian restaurant on the west side of Manhattan. The restaurant has now been closed for more than 20 years, but in 1976, it was still one of the tourist stops in the city. When we walked in, St. John's coach Lou Carnesecca was talking.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?